Hi, I'm Rory Kennedy.
Hi, I'm Mark Bailey.
And you are watching the Break It Down show. We are big fans of the work of Rory Kennedy, who, if I'm counting correctly, this is your 22nd picture as a director or project as a director. Can't really call it a picture. Is that right?
I have not been counting lately, but I've definitely made a lot of documentaries over the
Yeah,
years.
so it's up there. And we've frequent viewers of the show have seen you on before, and we've talked pretty exhaustively in our last visit about your body of work. But the last time we talked to you was right after Above and Beyond NASA's Journey to Tomorrow. In any case, I'm going to encourage everybody to look at whatever in your work they can find and get their hands on, because we've loved a bunch of those films. And today, though, we're talking about your latest project, which comes out on April 1st for HBO and Warner Brothers, and it is called the Synanon Fix. So I'm going to ask both of you, and you can answer one after the other. Why this topic? What was fascinating about this topic?
Well, this is a story that has largely been untold. We live in Los Angeles County, and Synanon started in Santa Monica in 1958. It started as a drug treatment program. It was the first treatment program that helped heroin addicts, and it was the first residential program in the United States. It turned into a kind of communal living environment, and then over the years evolved into what many consider to be a cult. Although that remains a question as to whether it was indeed a cult or not. We were fascinated with this story because it impacted so many people. Probably 20,000 plus people went through Synanon. It really spawned the therapeutic community programs that we're familiar with today. It was the beginning of all that. And it's also just a fascinating story. I mean, this was a program that started. It was sort of founded on two pillars. One was you couldn't use any drugs or alcohol, and the other was no violence. And 20 years later, they had bought more firearms than anybody in the history of California, and they had an open bar in the facility. And so looking at this story and how it went from one extreme to the other in a couple decades, and really understanding it from the people who lived through it. There's no narrator in the film. It's really all the perspective of the people who had firsthand knowledge of living through Synanon, telling the story and how they came to make sense of this world is pretty fascinating. We also had amazing footage and archive, and we felt like we could really tell a story that helped people understand what it was like to be in Synanon and live through it from the inside out.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Well, thanks, John. I would say that it seemed to us to be a very timely series, because I think if you kind of look out at the contemporary landscape today, well, generally the public right now, there's a sort of current fascination in cults, in cult stories, and that I think part of that is this awareness of sort of leadership in charismatic leaders, and looking out at the world today and looking out at people at various communities in different directions they might be taking. And so you see that sort of writ large in stories like Synanon, where you have a man like Chuck Dietrich, who initially starts out as, a very committed, service-oriented, dealing with a population of addicts that nobody else is willing to take on. And over time, he builds a community around it and takes that community on this sort of journey that, you know, kind of goes from healing to sort of, you know, horror on some level. And how does that happen? And that was, I think, also part of our interest in it.
I also appreciated how much it is reflective of so much that's going on today, but also a period piece. And for anybody who had a preconceived notion of what Los Angeles was like in the 50s, this picture really makes, a whole different image of Los Angeles emerges. And I'm curious as to what came first. Did you find out about the story and find the characters, or did you engage with characters who were able to help you to make the creative decision to have it be narrated by their individual stories?
Well, Mark actually came to the story first through reading a book about Art Pepper biography, where he talked about going to Synanon. And, you know, the truth is most of our documentaries, we don't have narrators, and we really like to try to have that kind of immersive experience for the audience, where they can really try to relate to what people are going through who are on the front lines of any given either issue or story or whatever it is that we're tackling. And we really felt like, you know, the people, as we got to know them, were so fascinating. I mean, part of what's so interesting about them is they're enormously relatable. And, you know, you want to think, you know, when people go through these experiences, because, you know, in the extremes of Synanon, there were forced abortions and forced vasectomies, and people were shaving their heads. You know, it was pretty extreme behavior, but they're enormously normal, you know, quote unquote, and are not unlike, I think, you and me and my husband and, you know, whoever. So I think part of what was so fascinating is really trying to understand their perspective of how they came to land in Synanon, why they stayed there, and what motivated them and what drew them to it. And then, you know, why in the face of such, you know, extreme behavior, they didn't leave, right? And I think, I mean, you know, I would say, as you noted, I've made, you know, dozens of documentaries over my career, and I think on average they've been like 2-hour interviews. These averaged somewhere between 7 and 9 hours for each interview. And, you know, they were never boring. I mean,
Yeah.
it was fascinating from like minute one until the end. And so it was really a wonderful experience for me to go on that kind of roller coaster, but also, you know, I think there was a way to tell this story that was much more sensationalist and really lean into the kind of, you know, quote unquote cult-like behaviors. But I think what drew us to it was that it was this really beautiful community in the beginning. It was interracial, it was forward thinking, it was helping drug addicts, it was helping these very marginalized, ostracized group of people that nobody else was looking out for in any meaningful way, and doing something really aspirational, you know. And then there was money and power and other things in the mix as it got, you know, older in age, and things deteriorated. And, you know, you can see that all over the course of the 4 hours and how that happens and what those factors are. And we found it enormously compelling.
Mark, when this story originally came to you, did you envision it as a feature-length documentary or as a series?
Well, that's a good question. You know, it sort of marinated around and knocked around in my brain a lot, and Rory and I would talk about it. And it was probably 10 years ago when I read that book about art that he and his wife Lori Pepper wrote, and you know, back then there were fewer documentary series. It wasn't a format that's as popular now. And I think that as you started to see more and more documentary series, and we started to think about subjects that would lend themselves to a series, this, you know, started to take shape. And so we really always conceived of it, once we got into it, as oh, we're going to do this as a series. And Synanon spanned, you know, 30 years. And so we've got 4 hours on those 30 years. And it really was hard discipline, you know, killing all your darlings in terms of like getting it down to that time. The subject, I mean, it really deserved to be a series, and it had to be. And I just would also say, John, on your other question about sort of history, one of the things that we really liked about it and tried to do with the series, and that you see throughout the different episodes, is, you know, it begins in 1958, and in 1968, America's completely different than it was in 1958. And Synanon's completely different, and Chuck Diederich is completely different, and the community there is. And so through Chuck's evolution and through Synanon's evolution, where it's constantly changing, it really mirrors America and California. And so that's like a great thread of the story that you see. And one of the kind of, and it was really necessary, because when you try to understand what they're doing, oh, we're going to go up to, you know, West Marin and create a self-sustaining city, right? Yeah. You're like, what? But in 1970, 71, 72, people were taking those kinds of, you know, swings at things, and we're trying different alternative lifestyles. And so we felt that that was really a rich way to kind of interweave both, you know, America evolving Chuck and Synanon together in these threads.
So do you think that there was a single tipping point where the corruptive factors that Rory mentioned, the money coming in and all of the accolades building up, and the realization that there was something going on there that was changing the tide of culture, especially around addiction? Was there a tipping point at which things, quote unquote, went bad? Either of you?
Do you want to? You go.
Well, I would say that there wasn't, to me, a single tipping point. That it did have that sensation of kind of the frog in the water, for the people who were there, where, you know, it was kind of, he would, you know, Chuck Diederich would mandate one thing. He would mandate, okay, we're all going to shave our heads. And then, you know, it started with, nobody's going to eat sugar, and then we're all going to exercise, and now we're going to shave our heads. And, you know, then evolved into, we're going to have, you know, forced abortions and vasectomies, and we're going to all change partners.
Uncouplings.
And, you know, it kind of, and all of the mandates had kind of a rationale to them. And similar, I mean, I think the thing that's most, you know, tragic and difficult about the series is the treatment of the children, right? So in the early days, the children were folded in, and they had kind of this magical life on the beach in Santa Monica, and they were integrated. I mean, they were in these spaces where there were people kicking, and they would help them like with their, you know, while they're kicking, people are
heroin
on the couch, and, you know, they're throwing up in the buckets, and the kids are taking the buckets, and they're like part of this crazy, wacky community. Mark, you go ahead.
Okay.
Speaking of crazy, wacky communities.
Right on cue. I think that, you know, it's hard to know what sort of external factors impacted the changes that happened in Synanon, and I guess what we would look at as a kind of deterioration or a drifting radically off their original path, whether those were external things like wealth, right, or you know, and being imbued with power and things like that, or they were internal within Chuck, because Chuck also, and this is how it is like a cautionary tale about when you sort of a community pins its fortunes to sort of one individual. If that individual goes, you know, driving off the cliff, you go with it. And so Chuck's, I think, you know, he was mentally ill, and his wellness, you know, he lost his management of that. He lost his wife Betty of, you know, several decades. He lost his sobriety, you know, so all of these things happened within Chuck, and then also there were external factors. And I mean, I think Rory's right that it was gradual, but if you look at that metaphor, like when the water hits boil, I would kind of say that the water hit boil in the mid 70s, around 1975, 1976, which was, you know, like 15 years into Synanon's lifespan. I mean, Synanon had been a very effective, innovative, much celebrated, groundbreaking rehabilitation and therapeutic community. And Synanon had also become and transitioned into a pretty remarkable commune that was self-sustaining and independent and dynamic, and, you know, in that first 15 years, but it kind of turned in somewhere in the sort of mid 70s.
So Mark,
is this? Oh, go ahead, John.
Go ahead, Pete.
I was gonna. One of the things that strikes me when you see this stuff all building up in California is, you know, the social and cultural revolution. Is this part of it? What makes these things inevitable? I mean, there's so much of this stuff in California: Manson family, Purple People Eaters, People's Temple. It's almost like it became a cult machine. If you're looking at it from the worst point of view, there's other great things that come out. But is this just kind of a product of the time? This growth towards that end of it, or is this a flawed man who, you know, reaches his point where he can no longer handle it? And was that inevitable?
Well, I think with your charismatic leader, that instability is sort of baked into that part of what makes you so is a manic. I mean, Chuck was diagnosed as being manic depressive at the end, and like that kind of manic change oriented behavior has a certain attractiveness to it. And so, you know, as one of the characters says, you know, charismatic leaders are good for 10, 20 years, but they always crash, right? And you don't want to be sort of tethered to them when they do crash. But I also think, Peter, that point about the times in California, that the time and place are significant, that the Cultural Revolution was a time when it was about exploration, inward exploration, social exploration, and you found people, whatever you wanted to call them, leaders, gurus, whatever, that were throwing out new ideas and different ways of living, and communities formed around them. And Synanon was one. And it happened to have a very interesting origin story as a rehabilitation center, right? But when it reached, you know, 68, 69, that's when non-addicts started joining, and it grew exponentially, and the wealth grew exponentially. And you had this non-addict community that was really turning it into something else that was, to a large degree, of time and place, I would say. Rory, I don't know if you want to chime in or.
No, I think you captured it well.
Okay.
So because we have things that we all can relate to about all of these characters, and I think that you know, when you said that the characters are all ultra relatable, that's absolutely true. Even when you watch Addicts, if you've never been through heroin addiction, you can still relate to desperation. You can still relate to hopelessness, and then you can relate to clinging on to something that can bring you some hope, and, you know, climbing back and making a comeback. And then even in Chuck's case, the charismatic leader, we all, you know, can relate to some degree to being in command of a mission and being that purposeful. Is the story itself, in its relatability, is it a I have a hard time saying that it's just that it's a cautionary tale, because somehow there remains hope in all of these characters who have made it out the other side.
That's really well said. I don't know. I mean, I think that there's one character who says that Synanon is both a promising story and a cautionary tale, and that, you know, there was a lot of amazing things that Synanon accomplished, and it saved a lot of lives. And the people that Rory interviewed are fantastic. I mean, they're articulate, they're honest, they're, you know, raw, they're real, and so many, and they had a beautiful connection to each other and to their community, and that offers hope for possibility and connection and a kind of, you know, sharing of lives together, as you know, but it didn't end in a good place. And so that's the,
But you know, I do think that you know, looking at Synanon, and particularly the first episode where we're really celebrating kind of this vision and the success of it in those early years, that, you know, at the core of it was the game, right? Where they would have this kind of confrontational therapy, and where, you know, it was an environment where that was really the heart of Synanon. And if you had any issues with anybody, if they rubbed you the wrong way, if they didn't clean their dishes, if they said something that it was hurtful to you, I want to go game you, you know, and it could be your husband, and then 12 people get in a room and you have this confrontation, you work it out and you talk it through. And, you know, I mean, I see the value of that today, you know, to be that honest. And I think that in addition to that, you're living in this community where you're deeply connected. You know, what every single person I interviewed said, you know, the relationships that I have coming out of Synanon are deeper, are the most meaningful in my life, are, you know, richer than anything I've ever been able to experience since. And I do think that there is value in watching the series to understand what that means. And in today's environment where people are so, you know, they're kind of live it, you know, they've got social media, they're working out of their homes, you know, there's a loneliness amongst people. And I think seeing this connection that they have, you know, there's something really valuable and poignant in terms of like the lived experience for all of us of that human connection. And I think there's a lot that we can continue to learn from Synanon, even though it's also a cautionary tale.
Yeah, I hope that we don't summarize it in a way that makes people I don't want to say fearful, but hesitant to really dig into it, because it is a deep exploration that is a lot of, well, let's not do that again, but let's not give up on doing this kind of thing for each other. And you brought up the game and this therapy session that they had. It seemed groundbreaking in the use of a group therapy session in that way as well. And the emotion that brought out in people, it seemed like you captured a lot of what came from that in your interviews. Rory, was there a sense of overwhelm when you had to conduct these interviews with all of these folks who I mean, you've interviewed a lot of people. Were this batch of folks as a group, were they more articulate or more expressive with their emotion than others who hadn't been through something like this?
They felt like they were professional talkers. Like they were really, really good at talking, but not just, you know, speaking, but actually speaking. I mean, they were great for a documentarian because they're honest, they're reflective, they're, you know, they explore ideas in a very deep way. They're able to look back on their past selves and have insight. And they all had really fantastic memories of what happened and what they lived through and what their experiences were like. I mean, I think that because the core of Synanon was the game, and as we show in the series, the game started as these kind of 1-hour sessions 3 times a week, but then, as with everything at Synanon, it was often taken to an extreme. And so then they evolved that to doing 24-hour sessions of talking, and then eventually 72 hours of staying awake, and this kind of deprivation and what they called the trip, because it kind of resembled being on LSD, I think, in terms of what happened to you. But, so they were really good at it. I mean, they were fantastic. And I remember thinking after doing the first 2 or 3 interviews, like, this could be a 9-part series or a 12-part series, because there's so much. I mean, I think the 4 hours is a really good time frame for the film, but I do think that we had to make a lot of really hard choices, particularly with characters who were endlessly fascinating and all going through their own journeys, right? And so there was opportunities to do kind of deeper dives into these individual stories. Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let that be the last thing that I ask of you, Rory. And our viewers know that we're big fans of you, but now we're big fans of Mark as well. So, Mark, I want to close up by asking you: did this story, as it unfolded, was it as you had envisioned when you embarked on the journey and pitched it?
No, it wasn't. And I think that, Rory touched on some of that it was both in some ways more beautiful and meaningful what they had there. I mean, there was a part of me that's like, man, I would have liked a little time there. Like, it was like, that was real connection, and there was an intensity, and there was, this is obviously more in the first half of its lifespan. So that aspect of the specialness was richer and more profound. And then how wacky it got. And, I have resisted. I don't say in sort of the tagline, I guess, for the series is, did The Cure become a cult? And there's a question mark. And that was kind of part of our exploration. And I don't know that I fully have answered that for myself, but it was both more beautiful, and then there was a lot of harrowing stuff that you kind of just can't ignore either. That was, deeply intense and upsetting. And, I was surprised by that as well. So I think on both ends of the extreme.
Well, let's conclude by letting everybody know that it is deeply intense, and you will be fascinated by it. And it's going to give you some material that forces some explorations in what you think about rehabilitation, what you think about addiction, what you think about quote unquote cults, and definitely what you think about charismatic leaders. And so, Mark, Rory, we're, like I said, big fans of yours, and we want to have you on for anything that you're doing.
Thank you.
Pete, thank you for having us on Break It Down. It's great. And I appreciate all of your thoughtful questions.
Always love being
thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.